Good afternoon. My name is Mark Kohlhase. I'm the Vice President of Scholarly Publisher Services at Allen Press. And I'm happy to welcome you to the special Peer Review Week webinar, Diversity in Peer Review, a conversation with Charles Fox. Before we get started with that conversation, I want to cover a few details related to the webinar. First, we'll be answering all questions at the end of the webinar. If you do have a question, just click on the questions box on the main menu sidebar and type in your message. If you're having technical difficulties, please use the questions feature to contact us and we'll do our best to help you. If you're having trouble hearing, please call in and listen to the webinar over the conference line. The toll-free telephone number and participant code are listed in the audio section of the main menu. Just click on the phone call radio button and the credentials should appear on your screen. Joining us today is the Executive Editor of Functional Ecology, Dr. Charles Fox. Dr. Fox is the Professor of Entomology at the University of Kentucky, where he supervises a research lab in which he and his studies study evolutionary and behavioral ecology of insects. Dr. Fox is also the Executive Director of the journal Functional Ecology and has spent the past several years studying peer review, diversity, and inclusion as it pertains to gender and geographic location. Today, we'll ask Dr. Fox what his research into peer review has shown, what positive steps he's taken as editor of Functional Ecology, and what strategies publishers and editors can take to maintain a diverse and inclusive peer review process. As I said, I'm Mark Kohlhase with Allen Press. I've been here since 2012. Before that, I spent a number of years as a bookseller. At Allen Press, I've had the pleasure of working with a handful of different teams within the Scholarly Publisher Services division, including editorial services, composition, and managing editing. I also enjoy being a member of CSE and SSP, and I'm currently on the finance committee of SSP. Also here from Allen Press is Allison King. She's managing editor and has been here for about 4 years. Allison has a BS in Environmental Studies and Classics from Gettysburg College and an MA in Classics from the University of Kansas. Outside of the office, Allison enjoys cooking, making costumes, and spending time with her fiance and their 2 cats. Also joining us from Allen Press is Melanie Bonney. Melanie is also a managing editor here and has been with the company for more than 4 years. She has a B in English Literature from the University of Kansas. And in her spare time, Melanie enjoys writing, playing tabletop games while engaging with her friends in in-depth analysis of pop culture properties. Welcome to you all, and welcome, Dr. Fox. It's great to have you here.
Well, thank you for inviting me to talk with you guys today.
Absolutely.
Hi, this is Melanie. It's great to be talking with you.
Hi, Melanie.
I'm going to jump right into our questions here. So Chuck, how did you get started in peer review research?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I'm an evolutionary biologist and ecologist by trade, and I've been working as an editor of a journal, but I don't really do or haven't historically done work in sociology. I was at a scientific meeting a couple years ago and went to a presentation that was talking about basically how good peer review is, how reliable reviewers are at judging quality of manuscripts. And I came away from that presentation being very disappointed in the quality of data that was presented and started thinking about the data sets that I had access to at the journal. At that time, I was at that meeting with Liz Baker, who was managing editor of Functional Ecology, and Liz and I were very close and talked a lot, and we started talking about kinds of analyses that we could do with data for functional ecology. So that sort of kickstarted my thinking about this. Originally, I think what we were planning to do was fairly modest, ask a few questions about quality of reviews, but that very gradually expanded into all the different kinds of questions that people are asking in the literature. I started reading a lot and discovered all these sort of fascinating problems that people were facing, trying to solve. And that sort of started us off. After I did a little bit of work on functional ecology, I was able to approach a few other journals, and so I'm now working with data sets from 6 different journals. I think we got about 23,000 manuscripts in our data set, and we're doing work on that.
Excellent. Can you tell us a little bit about the specifically reviewed?
Okay, you just dropped out of the conversation there. I heard a couple of words and that was all.
About scientific publishing and peer review, specifically within.
Okay, I missed most of what you said because you're breaking up bad, but what I think you're asking about is the research that we're doing into publishing and peer review, and a bit about the work we're doing in peer review diversity, reviewer and editorial diversity. So I've ended up tackling a much greater array of problems than I ever thought I would talk about or be doing research on. We've been looking at reviewer recruitment and how difficult it is to recruit reviewers and why. It's getting harder for journals to recruit reviewers. Looking at how effective editors are at judging quality of papers and whether they make good decisions. In fact, I just had a paper published today on that topic, on gatekeepers in peer review. But a big major theme and the topic of our discussion today is looking at diversity. So I think there's been a couple of major themes regarding diversity that we've worked on. I've been very interested in patterns of authorship, gender differences in authorship, and geographic variation in authorship. And we've identified patterns such as, I think it's fairly well established that women tend to be fairly well represented as first authors of papers, but are poorly represented as last authors of papers. And so we've been looking at how that's been changing over time and how likely that is to eventually reach greater equality in the last author, senior author position on manuscripts. We've also been looking at corresponding authorship, and one of the results we might talk about later is that women tend to defer corresponding authorship to co-authors more often than do men. And so I've been interested in that pattern, what causes it, and what the consequences of that are. We've also been looking at whether women are evaluated differently during the peer review process than men. So it's very well established in the literature in all sorts of contexts that women tend to be evaluated differently than men, whether it be on teaching evaluations, when controlled studies are doing changing names on manuscripts. We see that women are often evaluated more harshly for equivalent levels of performance, equivalent documents as men. And we've been interested in to what extent that actually takes place in the scholarly literature. So I might go into this work maybe naively thinking that scientists, of course, who are established in the field would not be influenced by some of these unconscious biases in their assessment of women. And so some of my early work suggested that there's very little evidence that papers authored by women perform more poorly during peer review than papers authored by men. But our more recent work on a larger data set is finding small but fairly consistent differences throughout the process, where papers authored by women tend to have lower success rates, get lower scores during peer review, and are less likely to be published. Effect sizes on the order of 3 to 9%, depending on the specifics of the analysis we do. So we're exploring that in more detail, what causes that, what are the consequences of that for scientific publishing. And then the other sort of last major theme is looking at gender and geographic diversity on editorial boards and in reviewer populations. It's well demonstrated, again, in the literature that diversity of individuals participating in a project brings diversity of perspectives and diversity of ideas, and that's generally good for research. Having alternative ways to think about problems and find solutions is good, and so diversity improves the quality of work. We've been interested into what extent that's true in the editorial and review process. So part of that project has been looking at how diversity in editorial boards varies over time, looking at diversity in reviewer populations, both gender diversity and geographic diversity. And sort of the key result there is that women are extremely underrepresented on editorial boards, But in ecology, the field I work in, that's actually been changing a lot. The community is very aware of gender disparities in many aspects of scientific publishing and academia, and there's been major strides made at many journals to improve the diversity of editorial boards. Women still remain very underrepresented among reviewer populations, though, and so we're interested in how we can improve that and why that's the case. One result we observe consistently among journals, I see this in 5 of the 6 journals for which I've been doing data analysis, is that women reviewers invite more women to review than men do. And one of the possible explanations of that is that the research interests of women and men are different, and so the types of papers that individuals are handling are different, and thus the population of possible reviewers varies but depending on the type of paper. But there's other possible explanations. We see large age effects, editor age effects on reviewer recruitment, which leads to some predictions and hypotheses to be tested. We also find this really interesting result that there's a large geographic effect on peer review. And this is actually something that was recently reported in a paper online by Murray and colleagues that was literally just published a few weeks ago as a preprint online. But we see the same exact thing, that reviewers tend to be more positive towards papers authored by people in their same geographic location. And we see this for a large number of countries, and we almost never see the reverse, that reviewers are more negative towards papers authored by people from their region of the world. But we definitely see a very strong pattern of reviewers being more positive. So exploring some of the consequences and causes of those sorts of patterns has been a major theme and will be for at least for a while into the future, until I've sort of run out of the data sets that we have.
So as a member of the majority demographic, what steps do you take to ensure diversity on editorial boards and among reviewers at Functional Ecology?
Yeah, so when I started as executive editor of Functional Ecology a little over 10 years ago, we switched models where we had previously not had an editorial board. We had an advisory editorial board, but they didn't handle manuscripts. And we switched over to having an editorial board that actually handles manuscripts. And so I was tasked with recruiting our first set of associate editors for the journal. And when I look back on that now, one thing that's really striking is the very large number of men, and particularly American men, which it reflects, of course, my own history. And I think what I was doing then is I was using my own personal experiences with people to choose editors to join the journal. And that turns out, I think, to be a fairly poor approach, because our personal experiences are very limited. We tend to know people, we tend to interact with people that are like ourselves and that are located fairly close to where we live, because those are where we go to science meetings, and certainly we travel internationally, but we are going to know many more people like ourselves than we are people that are different from us. And that leads to a fairly non-representative population of people to choose from. So what we now do, and we've been doing for many years, is we make a really serious effort to look through the literature using a variety of resources online. We write to people and ask for recommendations for people to invite to our editorial board. And we try very hard, of course, always to get the best people that we can get. We have specific needs, subject area needs. We need people that have that we're confident will do a good job, possibly have at least experience reviewing, if not experience as editors. But we also make a very serious effort to recruit people from areas of the world where we don't have representation. And we pay great attention to our gender diversity on our board as well. So now we're in a position at Functional Ecology where we have a fairly diverse board. At least gender diversity is very good. I think we're about 45% female on our editorial board. Our geographic diversity still is much less representative of the world than our author population is, but we're aware of that, and we make efforts to find people in regions of the world where we're not represented whenever we can. The British Ecological Society owns the journal Functional Ecology, and they have taken a number of steps as well. The society is very concerned about diversity. It's It's in many of the society's policies that they recognize diversity, they encourage diversity. And as part of their programs to improve diversity, we've had an open call for editors where we advertised and we let people self-nominate to become editors of the journal, and then we reviewed those applications and invited quite a few of those individuals to join the board. The biggest problem that occurred from that is even we did actually get a very diverse pool of applicants from around the world. So geographic diversity was pretty good, but gender diversity was actually very poor. For all of the journals, we did this for all of the BES journals, applicants were overwhelmingly male, about 73% male across all of the journals. And so gender diversity was not very good. We did identify a lot of early career researchers that were enthusiastic, and so in that sense, we had great success. We identified a lot of people from around the world, but it didn't help with the gender diversity aspects of the journal. This is maybe a very slight bit off topic, but I think it's really relevant, and a point I wanted to make today is one of the problems that we face when recruiting editors for the journal, and this is different for reviewers, but for editors, at all of the journals for which I have data, which is 3 different high impact factor journals, women decline applications to join editorial boards at much higher rates than do men. And so that's something we face as well with increasing gender diversity on our board, is we do need to identify more possible female candidates and invite more to get a similar number of individuals of each gender on the editorial board.
Absolutely. I'm wondering, are there any official codified policies in place at Functional Ecology to encourage editor and reviewer diversity, or is it more of an informal agreement?
So at Functional Ecology, we don't really have specific policies to encourage diversity. It's more informal. The BES, though, the British Ecological Society, does have it as part of their strategic plan and policies that we will encourage and protect diversity in ecology and at the journals. So we are required to report to the BES our recruitment of editors to join our editorial board, why we've chosen, I don't think we actually define specifically why we chose individuals, but we do have to justify why we needed to recruit outside of having a public call, and we report our gender and geographic diversity as part of that. This is a fairly new thing. Since the public call went out, which was only about a year ago, we've only recently had to start reporting, but the society is very aware, and so there is now tracking of what editors are doing. We can't just go off and do our own thing without some level of supervision. I do think, however, that we've definitely been very thoughtful about this at the journal. There are 5 of us at the senior editor level, and then there's managing editor with the journal and a couple of editorial office people. And all of us are paying attention to diversity, and the topic comes up every time we talk about recruiting new editors for the journal. For reviewers, it's a little more complicated because we have almost 100 associate editors working at the journal, and they individually pick the reviewers that they want to review papers. And so we don't have official policies other than that we encourage diversity. But we don't actually have official policies to force diversity. Again, I would say at the BES, though, the British Ecological Society, they have a number of programs. Like there's an Equality and Diversity Working Group, which is regularly addressing diversity issues, both in publishing and in membership and other areas of ecology. There's also a Women in Ecology mentoring scheme. I don't know much about it, but that's run by the British Ecological Society. And then the journals, the various journals owned by the BES, which includes Functional Ecology, we have an associate editor mentorship program. We only have a small number of individuals in there, and it's more geared at recruiting early career scientists, people who are a bit too junior to be editors on a journal, but sort of right at that stage where they're getting close, and we can bring them on with some mentoring to ensure that we get some age diversity and perspective diversity. So it's not targeted at gender and geography per se, but it is another form of diversity that helps improve at the journals.
So you mentioned mentorships, but are there other ways that editors can prompt and sustain a willingness to review research, something like stipends or outreach programs that might create a more diverse pool of reviewers?
Yeah, this is a topic I've wondered about, and I don't know nearly as much about. There's certainly a lot of debate online about why is it getting harder to recruit reviewers. We see this at the British Ecological Society journals, that we get more frequent declines than we used to. I've got some of that data published online you can look at if you're interested in. And there's a question about why, and there's been a lot of discussion about whether reviewers are being overused and what's causing it. And I don't really have a clear answer for why, but it is clear that we need the community to recognize that reviewing manuscripts is an important part of the publishing process. It's important for the scientific community. So we need ways to encourage individuals to participate in that. Should people be paid to serve as reviewers? I don't know. Some journals clearly are making substantial amounts of profit and could use some of those profits to support a reviewer population, but I'm skeptical that most journals could afford that, and that the sheer number of manuscripts that journals review and the sheer number of reviewers that we need to recruit makes any possible stipends that journals could pay out fairly small per review, per paper. And I'm skeptical that, at least for established scientists, individuals who have a salary, and clearly not everybody does, but of individuals that have a salary, that would be in itself much encouragement to review. I think people largely need to do it because they think it's important. They get something from the process, and that they're getting to see research that people are doing before it's published, which is beneficial for the authors in that they're learning something, and it's beneficial for the reviewers in that they're getting positive feedback. It's beneficial to the journals because they're getting advice on whether a paper should be published and what they should require of that paper if it is going to be published. So yeah, I don't really have good insights into what we should be doing to encourage more people to review. As far as encouraging people from backgrounds where where they're not being approached by journals to review, but they want to review. So maybe people from developing countries, or people that are young and haven't developed their reputations yet, so that they're not being seen by the editor population. There are a couple of places online where you can self-nominate as reviewers. There's a couple of databases. There's one called Diversify EEB. There's another called Early Career Reviewer Database. I think in both of those, people can self-nominate, and editors, at least some editors, do go look at those to find people that are enthusiastic about reviewing. I think most editors realize that having expertise in a subject is, of course, important in the reviewers that you choose and in the editors you recruit to your board. But enthusiasm is also really important. You need people who are willing to put some effort into the job, whether it be as reviewer or editor. And those places are where enthusiastic people that want to be involved in the process are going to self-nominate. So that's one way I think that people can be identified as prospective reviewers or prospective editors. Another thing you could do if you're interested in whether joining an editorial board or becoming a reviewer is to contact the journal, contact the editorial office. We don't have many people that have done this, but we have a few people on an editorial board that actually came to us. They wrote us and said, I really would love to be an editor for your journal. And we go look at their record and we look at what they've been doing, and we say, wow, this person's really great. And they clearly want to be here. And since they want to be here, we expect they'll do a good job. And they generally do. They're generally enthusiastic. So I would encourage people to reach out to journals. And sure, there's a possibility that they won't respond and that they won't invite you, but there's also a possibility that they will. And so take that initiative to reach out.
Off of that topic, there's information in some of your research that indicates that female reviewers are less likely to respond to an invitation to review, but more likely to accept an invitation if they respond. Do you have an explanation for that?
Yeah, so we've actually seen that pattern that female reviewers are less likely to respond to the invitation to review, but more likely to agree to review that across multiple journals. I've only published it for Functional Ecology. It's been seen at a couple of other journals in other published work, but I've also seen it in some of the other journals that I'm analyzing data for. So why would that be? All I can really do is speculate, but I would suspect that the reason women are less likely to respond to the invitations is that their email addresses go out of, stop being checked, stop being monitored more often than for male reviewers. And the reason that would be is that we already know that there's a leaky pipeline in science, that women are less likely to continue on from graduate school in science. They're less likely to continue on from postdocs than men are. And if women are dropping out of science at higher rates than men, which they are, we would expect those email addresses to stop being monitored more often than they are for men. So I think that's the sort of simplest explanation. And I would emphasize that the effect sizes we're seeing are very small. These are just a couple of percentage points differences that we can see in our data, and we see them as consistent across years simply because we have so much data. There are so many review invitations going out that sample sizes are very large, but the effect sizes themselves are pretty small, but consistent. So women are less likely to respond to review invitations, I think, for that simple reason that our invitations are probably not getting to them as often as they are to men. Why are women more likely to agree to review? Again, I don't know the explanation for that. This could very well be personality differences. It could be, I don't really know. Except that I know that it's been seen again in multiple journals that I've got data for, and in a few published other studies online. So it's not an unrepeatable result. It's repeatable, but I don't really have an explanation for it.
Sure. Speaking of that sort of leaky pipeline situation for women in STEM fields, I'm curious if you think that is influenced by factors such as an institution's leave policy for maternity or paternity, and if your particular institution has any ways of addressing that to minimize that effect?
Yeah, so there's no question that university policies are extremely important for addressing the leaky pipeline problem. I mean, the social problem is of course not directly under the control of universities, and that is that women tend to take on more responsibility in the home and have more responsibilities outside of the workplace than do men. And the sacrifices that people often have to make to be successful in academic careers. It's a very competitive environment, and substantial sacrifices often are made by individuals to obtain jobs and be successful in those jobs. And the current academic environment is not particularly friendly to individuals who have responsibilities outside the workplace. And I think that needs to change. In my own department where I work, there is clear recognition that this is a problem. I don't really know a lot about our policies at the university for addressing it, but certainly I know for the community more generally, there are certainly inadequate policies, and women are being penalized more so than men because of these additional responsibilities that they take. One sort of interesting result I've seen in our editor recruitment data is for Functional Ecology, and I only have this for the journal that I invite editors for. When people decline or accept the invitation to join our editorial board, if they decline, they often provide an explanation, and I've kept track of those explanations that come in emails, and women much more often reference responsibilities outside of work that prevent them from taking on another work responsibility, an editorial responsibility. And men very rarely reference that. And of course, this could just be that those responsibilities are more on the minds of women, and the responses reflect the way people think about their responsibilities outside of work. But it also probably reflects that women have more of those responsibilities, and it certainly is impacting whether they're able and willing to take on additional responsibilities in the workplace, or in this case, service to the broader science community. I'm not sure if I lost track of your question there, but if I didn't quite answer it, feel free to point that out.
That was great.
Going back to reviewers in general, we were surprised that you found that reviewers were less likely to agree to review when the invitation comes from a more senior editor. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that more senior invitees are more likely to decline?
Yeah, so again, this is something I don't have data on, but I think the explanation has got to be fairly straightforward. I think most editors that are inviting reviewers, at least in part, use personal experience for identifying possible reviewers. So most of our associate editors get papers fairly close to their area of expertise. So they know a lot of people that work in that subject area. And when you're young, when you're an early career scientist, you're not going to know that. You're going to know the literature well, hopefully, because you're becoming an expert in your field. But you don't necessarily have these long-term personal contacts. Whereas senior editors have long careers of interacting with people, and they have lots of friends, they have lots of acquaintances that work in the subject area. So it's inevitable that when you get a manuscript in your area of interest, you say, oh, hey, I know so-and-so would be perfect to review this. And often those are going to be senior people that come to your mind. And it has got to be the case, and I'm fairly sure there's data that shows this, although I can't tell you off the top of my head, that more senior scientists get more review invitations and they decline much more often than young scientists, because they just get so many invitations. If you invite a postdoc or an early career scientist, they haven't been inundated with invitations because they're largely not known in their community yet, whereas the senior people are. So I think older editors, more senior editors, because of their experience in the field, they know lots of senior people. They use personal experience to invite reviewers. Those reviewers are senior people more so than the younger editors are inviting. And so they're getting a lot more declines. One other thing we observe is that actually the diversity of reviewers that are invited also changes with editor seniority. So younger editors tend to invite more gender diverse pools of reviewers than do more senior editors. We actually find that senior men tend to overwhelmingly invite male reviewers. Senior women invite far more female reviewers than do even younger women, and certainly far more female reviewers than do more senior men. And that actually holds up across all 6 of the journals for which I have data. We initially reported it for functional ecology, but it turns out to be something we observe across the broader data set that we've been examining.
So how can journals and editors connect with a pool of reviewers that are less senior and more geographically diverse?
Yeah, so I think that the number one point that I now have started making is that we need to not rely on personal experience to identify people to invite. And I think it's essential to be going online and looking at using various resources. It could be Google Scholar or Web of Science, using some of these databases that have been created online to highlight early career researchers in the field, and try to find the people that are actually doing the kind of work that you want to have reviewed. Our personal experiences lead us to choosing very non-diverse populations of prospective reviewers. We're mainly identifying people we have experience with, and those are people like us. So I strongly encourage people not to just use personal experience, and not just in the context of recruiting reviewers or even recruiting editors. I think this also applies when you're on a committee that's looking for nominees for awards. I've been in meetings where we've been discussing award nominees, and the committee members are bringing nominations to the group for discussion. And the nominees are overwhelmingly people that committee members know. And that's, of course, not going to be true for every society and every journal and in every context. But it's certainly been true in some that I've seen. And I think that creates a set of problems with low diversity. And, well, you know, sort of, I guess it's the old boys network, although it's not necessarily just men. It's lack of diversity in all contexts. But I think using more objective means of identifying prospective participants in whatever process it is you're working on and not relying so much on personal experience.
And have you noticed that the type of review, whether single blind, double blind, or open, has any effect on the biases that you're seeing?
Yeah, so with the journals I've been working with, the data I've been working with, we don't have that data. There are actually quite a few studies comparing single blind, double blind, and open peer review. And I think there are a couple of interesting take-home messages from that. We know that, for example, we know one of the biases that is clearly present is a prestige bias. We know that papers that are coming from researchers at more prestigious universities, whether it be Oxford or Harvard, those kinds of places, tend to get more deference from reviewers than papers from less prestigious universities or institutions. And of course, it's very hard to know whether that reflects quality difference or impact difference in the actual manuscripts. But you can, if you do single blind, double blind, open peer review comparisons, you see that some of those biases go away when reviewers are blinded to author identity. So I think one sort of bias, prestige bias, is probably actually affected by whether people know who the author is, and that being double blind will reduce that. There's actually very little data in academic publishing context about whether blinding reviewers to author identity affects, say, gender discrimination. There's a couple of suggestions in the literature, a couple of attempts to analyze that in the literature, but I think that's largely in the context of double single blind, uncertain. We really need experiments. There's only been a couple of published examples looking at it, but we really need experiments that more specifically ask that sort of question in those data. What has been shown is that open review tends to lead towards more positive reviews. That's potentially good for authors. Everybody likes to get a positive review. It's not necessarily good for editors, though, because editors want objective reviews, not necessarily positive reviews. We need to be informed about the manuscript as best we can and as honestly as we can, and not necessarily have entirely positive reviews. We also know there's been a number of published studies that have asked the question, can reviewers identify the authors of a paper when the paper is blinded? And what we learned from that is that reviewers frequently think they can, and sometimes they in fact can, but not as often as reviewers think. So blinding is partially, it's not fully effective, but it's fairly effective at preventing reviewers from identifying the authors. There are a couple of journals that have recently adopted optional double blind, where, for example, the American Naturalist does that. I think a couple of the Nature journals maybe do that. There are a number of journals that do that. And one of the results that's come from that is that the individuals who choose to be double blind, to choose to have their identity blinded from reviewers, they tend to be different types of researchers than those that allow single blind or accept single blind, and that's evident in the outcomes data. Authors that choose double blind, actually their papers tend to do much worse, and that's probably not because of double blind per se. It probably reflects more that people who have less strong papers are choosing double blind, whereas people that have stronger papers are not. But I don't think the data, because these are not controlled experiments, this is optional double blind, I don't think it allows us to disentangle those hypotheses. So I would argue that we need more controlled experiments, and we need controlled experiments that are going to specifically test hypotheses about gender and geographic biases. we at the British Ecological Society has been discussing these kinds of projects and whether it's actually practical or possible to do this with academic journals. I don't know what the outcome of that will be, but I think there's a recognition that those sorts of experiments and data need to be done.
Well, we've mentioned some things that we found surprising about your research. Was there anything that you yourself found unexpected when you were doing this work?
Yeah, so one of the observations we made a while ago, and it's turning out to really be fairly substantial effect in our data, is the role of corresponding authorship. So I didn't go into this project really thinking about, are corresponding authors different than other authors on a paper? But it turns out that who serves as a corresponding author of a manuscript seems to matter in a variety of ways. So the first result we observed that was somewhat striking, and the effect size here is modest but not huge, is that women first authors. So on most papers, the first author serves as the corresponding author. That's overwhelmingly the case in ecology journals. But women tend to defer corresponding author when they're first author much more often than do men. That's about a 15% effect size. So I think it's a fairly large proportion of women are deferring corresponding authorship more than men. That may simply reflect, again, this leaky pipeline that a lot of women graduate students leave science, so they may be maybe their advisors are taking over that role on their papers, similar postdocs at each stage of the process. But it's still a fairly large effect size. We also found, and this is not published yet, but this will be in the next paper I'm submitting, that when the first author defers corresponding authorship on a paper, those papers actually do really poorly in peer review. I mean, really large, like 30% effect sizes, 30% less likely to eventually be accepted at the first journal to which they're accepted than if the first author was corresponding author. And I don't know the explanation for that. I don't know what's causing that, but there's a couple of possibilities. One is that the first author, who's the person intimate with the research, if it's the student who did the work or postdoc who mainly did the work, may be deferring corresponding authorship to one of their co-authors, possibly their mentor, who's much less intimate with the research than the first author is. And so the paper's not as good. It has more problems. Maybe that person was less motivated to work on it. Maybe they just had less experience with the subject. But that paper is clearly doing worse. We also know that if we take that into account, some of the gender differences that are observed in outcomes of peer review actually start to go away. Not completely, but it contributes. And so I think there's a large body of possible questions there that we don't yet have answers to, and I don't even know that we have data to answer them. But this role of deferring corresponding authorship, I think, is really interesting. Oh, and one other point I would make, there's been a number of surveys done. This is mostly in the biomedical literature, I think, not in ecology, that have shown that people actually give the corresponding author a lot of credit for the work. The assumption among readers is commonly that the corresponding authorship took the lead on publishing that manuscript. And that could have consequences if women are deferring that role to their co-authors more than men. If they are staying in science and they're deferring that role, they're going to be getting less credit for their work. Now, again, we haven't looked at that in ecology, but it has been looked at for a couple of biomedical journals. And it strongly suggests that by deferring corresponding authorship to a collaborator, you're actually going to get less credit from readers about your role on that project. And that may be in the future be counteracted by authorship statements. Nowadays, it's becoming much more common to require authors to declare their role in a project. We've actually called recently that if the first author is not corresponding author, that there should be a declaration of why that's the case. Because there are some labs where it's just normal for the senior person to be corresponding author, but again, we see that has consequences for how credit is assigned to research. The corresponding author tends to get more credit than the first author if the first author doesn't play that role. So that's something that I found really interesting, and I think we're going to follow up on.
So for journals that want to start thinking about addressing diversity issues, how can an editorial board conduct a self-review, and how would those results be translated into action toward addressing diversity?
Yeah, well, I think self-reviews of editorial boards should be pretty easy to do because journals know who their editors are. And the population of editors at any individual journal is pretty small. So it's got to be very easy to just evaluate what does the diversity of your editorial board look like. The trickier part is knowing what to compare it to. So you can look at the diversity of your editorial board and compare it maybe to other journals that are similar to you, that are serving the same populations as you. That's one way, one sort of comparison. Another is you might compare to the population of authors you have. That's a little bit harder because when people submit papers, they don't declare themselves as male or female. So you actually need to go through and do some legwork to say, okay, our author, maybe we've got 1,000 papers we reviewed this year. What proportion of those have female first authors or male first authors? And there are ways of doing that using online databases, although there's quite a lot of error in that assignment. So that might be one possibility. Or you might compare to the gender diversity or geographic diversity of the membership in a society, like in this case, in the journals I work with, the British Ecological Society. But the problem with each of those is that the types of people you're choosing to be editor are not necessarily representative of the entire society that you're serving or the authorship population that's submitting to your journal. For example, we're not inviting graduate students and postdocs to be editors. We insist that the people that serve as editors at least have established their career to the point where they are no longer at such a junior stage that they're not really qualified to be editors yet. They're just a bit too young or inexperienced. They may be getting there soon, but not quite yet. Or maybe their employment is not stable enough. And to be frank, they really shouldn't be working as editors because they've got other priorities that they need to focus on to get themselves a stable position in academia or whatever their goals are. So the population of all possible people is not really a good point of comparison. And given we have so much age structure in our populations, our more senior people are more male, younger people are more gender equal, it's really hard to know what your actual targets should be. Similar sort of problem with geographic diversity. We get at Functional Ecology, we get papers from a very large number of countries around the world. It's a very diverse population of authors. But there are many regions of the world where the papers that we're getting are on average not performing as well as papers from different regions of the world. So the population of submitted papers is not going to be a very good metric for what we want our diversity at the journal to be. Maybe the population of accepted papers is a better metric. But the point is, I don't want to advocate for any particular metric. The only point I would make is that it's fairly easy to self-evaluate your diversity of your journal, but you need to decide what you're going to compare it to, and possibly other journals in your subject area, especially those that people are fairly comfortable with, have been taking into account diversity, have a diversity initiatives, diversity awareness. Those might be the best kinds of journals to compare with and identify whether you have a problem at your journal.
So in general, is there such thing as diversity achieved, or is it more of a moving target or process that's ongoing?
Oh, well, it's definitely a moving target, no question. Academia is certainly still dominated by men, especially at senior levels. That has been gradually changing. It hasn't changed yet, not enough yet, but it is gradually changing. The hope is that we'll get to a point where the population of academics is reflective of the population of people who want to be academics, but we're not there yet. So clearly the community is changing. It's changing both in the developed world in terms of gender diversity, but globally it's changing tremendously. Science rising in developing countries. I mean, there's a lot of developing countries that have long histories of doing outstanding science, but there are certainly regions of the world where that has been increasing substantially, especially in Asia, where we now get lots and lots of papers at ecology journals. And so clearly the pool of researchers that the societies are representing, that the journals are serving, is changing over time. And I don't think that you can have just sort of one metric for this is what it means to be diverse, and that's what we target. And I would emphasize that the journals, functional ecology I work with, and I think this is true for the British Ecological Society journals more generally, nobody has defined specific targets. There's clearly a recognition that diversity is important, and it's taken into account at all sorts of stages of both journals and at the society. But we're always also looking for the best people. You know, diversity is important, but we also want to get the best people working in the society, working at the journals, and so on.
And just to kind of wrap things up for us, where do you think the future of this research topic, both for you and the larger scholarly community as a whole, where do you think that that's headed next?
So where do you think research is headed next? Or yeah. Okay, gosh, you know, there are so many unanswered questions. There's clearly a very good recognition in academic communities now that diversity is important. There's much more recognition than there's ever been about unconscious biases. And what's really lacking, though, I think, is understanding of what the causes of some of our problems are. Causes of a lack of diversity, and clearly unconscious bias is a big cause of lack of diversity, but there are other causes as well. A lot of them are broader social problems that are not really academic or journal publishing problems, but they certainly impact academia and journal publishing. What's also not really entirely understood, we don't entirely understand all the contexts in which those problems occur. We don't, for example, in journal publishing, despite a fair number of experimental studies in sort of specific contexts showing that there are biases against women, we really don't entirely know how much that influences academic publishing more generally. And so I think there's still a lot of questions to be asked there. I feel like I'm giving a very unsatisfying answer. I think there's just a lot of work to be done, and there's a lot of understanding of what the problems are we still need to achieve, and we still need ideas about how to solve some of the problems. So the social problems, broader societal problems that impact academia and publishing. We need to come up with solutions, whether it be as a journal editor or whether it be as an academic researcher. We still need to, our universities, our employers still need to implement plans that will reduce the extent of these kinds of biases and the impact of these broader societal issues on women in science.
Okay, Dr. Fox, thank you. We do have a couple questions from our audience.
Okay, sure.
Excuse me. The first one is if you've been able to determine anything in the decisions made based on the relative diversity of the peer review group, so acceptance rate or some other metric, if you see a difference there.
Yeah, so two parts to this question. Let's talk about geographic diversity and gender diversity. In the work I've published so far, although we definitely see that women tend to invite different kinds of reviewers than men do, at least women invite more female reviewers and men invite more male reviewers. It's unclear what the actual explanation for that is. And we haven't, in the work that I've published so far, we haven't seen any evidence that if a female handles a paper or a male handles a paper as an editor, or if the reviewers are female, reviewers are male, we haven't seen any evidence that actually affects the outcome of the process. There's not, for example, in my data so far, an interaction between the gender of the reviewer and the gender of the author, or interaction between the gender of the editor and gender of reviewer. It seems to be fairly gender neutral in that sense. There's a recent paper published online that suggests that there's some evidence now that that's not true. This is that Murray et al. Paper, which has recently been published. I'm not convinced they've actually demonstrated that, but their data strongly suggests that having diversity among the reviewers actually does affect the outcome of peer review. You can look that up online for details. What we do know, and my data show this very strongly, and that same Murray paper also shows this, is that there is a big geographic effect. It is very clear in my data that the location of the reviewer affects how positively they rate a manuscript that they've reviewed based on the location of the author. And this has been called homophily or homophily online. People tend to give higher review scores to papers from authors that are in the same region of the world as they are. We actually see this for many countries. We never see the reverse in my data. It's always very clear. There's either no effect or there's a large effect in which people, reviewers, rate papers from their own geographic region higher than they rate other papers. We've seen that in my data. That's also been shown in Murray et al. Online. So yes, in part, I think that having reviewer diversity can affect the process of peer review. No evidence from my work that reviewer gender matters, but there is some evidence that reviewer location in the world does seem to matter.
And do you have any thoughts on why reviewer location and a common geography might affect the acceptance of the paper?
A little bit. Again, we don't have good data to test causes, so I'm just speculating. But we actually see two specific effects. We see that people are more willing to review papers if they're from the same geographic region as the author. And this is particularly true for authors that are in Asia. So if the reviewer we invite is from Japan or from China or other Asian countries, if the author is from those countries, the reviewer is more likely to agree to review. So there seems to be this, well, it's possibly driven by language issues. It could possibly just be driven by people from, say, native English-speaking countries are declining to review papers by authors from non-English-speaking countries, and those authors from those same non-English-speaking countries are not declining. So we see that as they're more willing to review. So that's one effect that very much shows up. Willingness to review tends to be influenced by where the reviewers are from and whether it's the same as where the authors are from. But we also see that in terms of scores that they give papers, and thus the outcome of the review process. And I don't really know what causes that. I mean, one could speculate that there's a bias there, that people tend to be more positive towards their, compatriots, people from their own country that they've had interactions with or know. That would be, of course, that could be an unconscious bias. It could be something more nefarious. I don't really want to speculate on that because I don't know. But it seems like a possible explanation.
Okay. And have you seen that whether there are certain fields where peer review diversity is more established than others?
Well, I would sort of toot the horn of my own research discipline. It's the one I know the best, but it is definitely the case that in the ecology and evolutionary biology community, there is really pretty tremendous recognition of the role of diversity. It's been that way for a while, but there are, if you look at published manuscripts testing hypotheses about diversity of reviewers, diversity of editorial boards, and so on, it's sort of surprising how many of them are ecologists looking at their own discipline. So I'm quite pleased, and of course I've had the benefit of being in this community for quite a long time and being exposed to these kinds of perspectives, and I presume they've influenced the way I think about the subject as well. I don't really want to comment on other fields. I know that a lot of fields are not nearly as gender diverse and don't talk about it nearly as much. But I would definitely put a plug in for ecologists as a population. It's a community that is definitely relatively self-aware about these issues of gender and geographic diversity.
Okay. Well, thank you for speaking to that and for all of your answers and information. We appreciate it. Those are all the questions we have from our audience today. I'd like to again thank Chuck for joining us in this presentation and providing a great discussion surrounding peer review diversity and inclusion. I'd also like to thank all of you, the audience who attended our webinar today. We hope you found this event engaging and will tune in to other and future Allen Press webinars. At the conclusion, we'll be sending out a brief survey that will ask you to rate the presentation, quality of content, and overall value. Your input is very helpful, so please take a few moments to complete the questionnaire. You'll also find in this email a recording of today's webinar. Feel free to download a copy for your records and share it with your friends or colleagues. We'll also have the webinar recording up on our website and YouTube channel by the end of the week. If you have any specific questions or comments about the webinar, please feel free to email us at marketing@allenpress.com. That concludes our session for today. Thank you again, Dr. Fox, and thank you all for attending. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Melanie and Allison. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Bye.